All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anthony Zerfis, and I'm actually with the Samsung Project Beyond team. And up here on stage with me, I have three awesome creatives who we've had the excellent opportunity to work with in terms of having them get a chance, a real unique chance, actually, we'd probably say, of using the Project Beyond camera. And so just to kind of give you a heads up as to what this is all about, we did come straight from the Samsung Developer Conference, which is right up in San Francisco. So some of the slides will say Samsung Developer Conference, but we are talking about the same things here. For those of you that are aware of Project Beyond, we'll talk a little bit about it, but this workshop is really geared about 360 video creation and the experiences that these three people up here have actually gotten an opportunity to learn about and hopefully instill some knowledge and some best practices on 360 video creation. So to kind of kick us off here, I'm just going to show you a quick video about what Project Beyond is really all about.
We were born with a desire to tell stories. So we invented tools that let our creations live through time. We put our imagination into motion and reframed reality. We built new ways to share stories, always looking for what's next. Today, we can capture 360 degrees of life. We can create immersive experiences that put you in the center and transport you to places you've always wanted to go. Where will your story take us?
All right, so really it's all about, making new stories and telling those stories in a different way. So before we get in and talk to the creatives here about their experiences with Project Beyond and some of their best practices, we'll talk a little bit about the camera overall. So a lot of this information is available on the Think Tank Team website. So Think Tank Team is the team that actually went on ahead and designed this camera for Samsung. It is stereoscopic 360-degree video recording, 4K video output, which is absolutely amazing, and 17 cameras. So you have 16 cameras around, and you probably won't be able to see it up here, but there is one camera up on the top as well. So it'll have 8 mics around it as well. So those mics will be integrated. There will be integrated storage, battery, live streaming capabilities, which, as we know, is really, really difficult to do. So it's pretty awesome that it's able to do it. And obviously stitching software, which is kind of the key for 360 video editing. So the camera overall is an amazing production tool, and these three creatives over here, I'll give them a quick introduction. So they've had the opportunity to actually basically record and film with this camera. Andy, I know I got an opportunity to work with you a little bit, but just to give you an idea as to who everyone is, this is Wasim. Wasim, do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself? And what you've done with the camera and what you've done in the past?
Sure. My name is Wasim. I'm a commercial landscape photographer and videographer. I spent most of the first part of my career working for brands, Fortune 500 companies, doing marketing and advertising videos and that sort of thing. And then transitioned into working with things that were closer to my heart and my soul. So I started working with people like California State Park System, National Park Service, Petau Influencer Conference, and and Earth Tones, which they do social emotional learning tools for education curriculums for public schooling that we're also trying to integrate a lot of this technology into. And then how I connected with these guys, I was a Samsung image logger, so I was a Samsung photographer. And when I saw the Project Beyond camera for the first time, I just kind of navigated towards that. And
he navigated by calling us quite a bit.
More than quite a bit. And they let me in the doors, and I've been playing with it, and I love the thing. So that's me in a nutshell.
We're really happy to have him on board. Next to him, to his left, is Sky. Sky, you recently had an amazing opportunity with Wasim to record with this camera as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about that opportunity?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Sky Mayring. I am a producer, travel blogger, and digital influencer. I got my start in traditional travel media, actually, working as a magazine editor at a trade publication called Travel Age West. I was the managing editor there for about 7 years and made the transition into video production, doing a lot of work for destination marketing offices and various brands in the travel space. And I also work as a digital influencer, and I'm sure many of you know that that's essentially, I would harness my social media following, align with brands that I think are a good fit for my fans and followers, and we work on digital campaigns together. Just this past weekend, for example, I was at Coachella and I did a Snapchat takeover for TripIt, and in the next week or two, I'll be doing a Vine takeover for a GoPro. And Wasim and I actually, we met almost 10 years ago, and we've been working off and on. It's been quite an interesting ride. Wasim told me about this opportunity, and I got very, very excited about it. And together, we were actually able to go to Tahiti for a week and film some really incredible footage, which I believe is going to be on the Milk VR channel. Unfortunately, we can't show it to you today, but in the future, you'll be able to view it. And there's all kinds of great Project Beyond footage on the Milk VR channel right now. Just search for Project Beyond.
Great. So yeah, I've had the opportunity to actually view some of that footage, and it is amazing. So definitely keep an eye out for it when they get a chance. Over to the far right is Andy, and Andy's a filmmaker based out of LA. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Andy, and how you got involved with Project Beyond as well?
Sure, yeah, I'm a director and producer based in LA. I've done features, shorts, narratives, documentaries across the spectrum. I too was a Samsung image logger, which is how I got to know the team putting this whole thing together. And the idea of shooting and working in 360 and telling stories in a new way was really appealing to me. So I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity to become a part of this group.
Yeah, we're actually very fortunate to have all three of you guys here, so thank you very much for being here with us and kind of giving us some of your knowledge on exactly, some best practices here. If we can just make sure that their mic is on, because they're going to pass it back and forth as well from time to time, so it'll be a little interactive. If you have any questions throughout the process, throughout the workshop, I do recommend just going ahead and write them down real quick, because we are limited to only the 2 microphones up here. So if you have any questions at the end, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get to you as soon as possible. So let's go on ahead and kick it off right into transition from 2D to 360. VR. As we all know, can I see I mean, it's very blinding up here, but I can see most of you. By a show of hands, has anyone done any 360 video recording before? That is awesome. All right, great. So, and how about any traditional 2D video recording? Most of you, absolutely. And that's kind of what I figured you were all going to say. So as you know, it kind of takes a certain kind of mindset to take yourself out of a 2D environment into a 360 environment. And all three of these creatives up here had that opportunity. And, I think they'll definitely have quite a bit to say about it. So you guys want to go on ahead and take it away on Tahiti and all your different experiences?
Sure, we can start. So like she said, we met on or I don't know if she said this part yet, but we met on a job together. It was for a lifestyle brand, and I was the photographer, and she was working as the writer and the blogger and all that stuff, or the editor there. And when I brought up this to her, I was super, super excited to use it, and I was super, super excited to travel. And she travels a lot, and so I said, where can we take this thing, and what can we do? And she said Tahiti. I said, okay, let's go. And we spent about 4 or 5 months to put that project together, and it came together. And we took off to Tahiti. And it was the first time that we had gotten hands-on experience with that thing, and personally, the first time I had hands-on experience with VR. And I spent over a decade working in regular 2D planes, from video to photography, writing, which is also another 2D plane in a creative sense. But this is the first time that I had worked in a 360 space. And I learned quite a bit, and it took, we saw that show of hands pop up of many of you that did regular video, went to 360, and I'm sure you guys have been through a lot of these experiences as well. But it's definitely kind of retraining your brain for the new tools that you could use, because it's really the first time that you can immerse somebody into that situation ever, I think, probably in the history of humankind. So it took a little bit of retraining our brain while we were out there, and we learned quite a few things, and I think you have something to say?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to add a specific example. If you could have seen the video, we were filming on a private island in Huahine, and we had a host who was doing a cooking demo. And traditionally, we would have filmed it just, straight on, focus on the host doing the cooking demonstration. But we found that once we actually watched the playback, that it was so static and so boring. We needed to create different points of action. So we actually made a triangle of sorts where we had the chef, the host, go and pick up the ingredients, which was a coconut, in one area, and then walk all the way to the other area where he was going to shave the coconut, and then walk to a third point, which was this beautiful table over the water. And as he was walking to the table, you could hear the splashing of the water, which was this visual cue for you to look down. And all of a sudden you see tropical fish underneath your feet, and you would have never thought to look down to view that. So it was a good learning experience for us to know that there are other kinds of cues, not just action, that sound can also be a cue. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as a director, I'm used to working with either a 16:9 or a 2:3:5 frame and really being able to contain the action in that frame. So the idea of really handing over control of the experience to the audience and not necessarily being able to have as much control myself felt a little bit daunting. So it really comes down to visual and sound cues to be able to focus the attention of your audience. And you spoke to the visual, but I think certainly with sound, that's going to become more and more important to help make sure that people are looking where you want. Because you're not always going to have everything in 360. Or if somebody's looking over to the right, but where the action is taking place is on the left, you need to find ways to redirect their attention. I saw one of the exhibitors here was using sort of a heat mapping technology to show you where a viewer is looking in your completed VR video, and I think that's going to be an exciting way to test and know through the process, as you continue to develop this, whether what you're doing is working. You may not be able to go and, let's say, reshoot something, but you could add a sound cue to make sure that the attention is redirected where your audience needs to be looking. So it's just thinking about things in a new way outside of that traditional rectangle.
And a lot of that does go, and I'm sure that you guys have also had a lot of experience with that, is that creating movement to guide that viewer, like she was talking about. So with the sound and creating movement in the frame, when you're used to just that 2D frame, you have control over everything that's in that 2D frame. And we're all, or most of us, are pretty experienced with putting on a headset and knowing that we could look around and experience everything around you. But whenever we show it to somebody that is not experienced with that, the first thing they do is they look right, they look left, they look up, they look down. They completely forget that there's a whole nother 180 to 270 degrees that they could, look around in as well. And so going on what she was talking about is creating that movement behind you, using those sound cues behind you and all that stuff, because as soon, it just takes that one time, and I know you guys all know this as well, for that person to actually get that sound cue or get that visual cue and see somebody walking and follow that person all the way around. And then they get it, and that's when their jaw drops open and like, oh, whoa. And then they get it for the rest of the, for the video or whatever demonstration you're showing them. But it is using that movement within the frame and using that sound to basically guide that viewer, especially as it becomes more and more adopted by the public.
I completely agree with you there, and I think that there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. And at first, we really have to spell it out for the viewer, where we have to give them the cues. Look up, turn around. Can you find X? Can you find Y? I think for now and in the next few months, and maybe it's not going to be that way a year from now, but those VOs that can actually point the viewer in the direction that you want them to go are pretty critical to start.
And one of the things that you guys brought up, was kind of in terms of VR as a whole, as 360 as a whole, is sometimes just learning to let go, let things happen as they are, because we can't always plan everything that's going to happen in 360 video, correct?
No, for sure. Yeah. That goes back to shooting on a 2D plane and being able to control everything that's in your frame, what's in and what's out of that frame, and everything that's out of that, that's not in that frame is equipment or crew or this and that. And that was super, super, super frustrating while you're out there and you're trying to get used to this, because it's like, oh, I don't want that person there, or I don't want that there. And then there's just a moment where you just have to tell yourself to let go and realize that that's kind of what puts the reality and virtual reality, is that there's these elements that if you controlled every single element in that frame, then it would no longer be something that people could relate to as reality, because it would be way too staged, it would be way too artificial. So you have to let the flaws of humanity kind of be part of the scene as well, in order to get that person immersed in the experience.
And I think if you're doing something in a more narrative realm, or doing commercial or something where you have full control over the scene, you can block your actors, you can block your set pieces so that you can control it. But for example, when Anthony and I were working and we hiked up to the back of the Hollywood sign, my gut instinct was, oh God, what are all these tourists doing here? They're going to ruin the shot. And Anthony pointed out that having actual motion in the scene and having those people up there lends itself well to the sense of reality and putting people in a place and giving them something to follow. If I hadn't had that, it would have felt just like a Google Street View image, which is great, but it's not what we're trying to do here, and it doesn't really give the full advantage of the 3D stereoscopic image or the fact that you've got moving video. It's just no better than a still.
Yeah, and I think you can really look at your loss of control as an advantage or a disadvantage. We were filming on this private island, and the cook right in the middle of it was halfway through, and we have this kayaker just go past. And Wasim and I looked at each other and we're like, this is going to ruin the shot. But it actually created a whole new point of interest, and that was something that we couldn't have planned for, and it was one of the better things that happened, we thought, during the shoot, and made it more spontaneous and just made it more interesting altogether.
Well, and kind of also speaking sort of to that is the things that may seem boring in reality, in virtual reality, they may not be boring, and most of the time they're not. Like, we were with one of the engineers of the camera, and what you're seeing up here is we were in the middle of one of the cities there, and it's just a bunch of food carts, food vendors, and he wanted to stop and shoot in the middle of these food vendors, and me and Sky just looked at each other like, why? It's just boring, there's no reason to do this. And then when we put on the headset and you experience it in VR, it was one of our favorite shots. And I think the reason is because it's that interplay between what you're seeing and the first time that you have a medium that's also playing psychologically on your mind with making you feel that you're in certain places. So it brings that relatable experience to the human, basically the human condition of being able to relate to being in that experience. And that's when, if they're thrown into a situation that's completely that's not a real situation for their first couple of experiences in VR, they're not going to get that sense of presence that they would get as if they were in an experience that they could relate to. And so I think that was the first time where I put it on. I'm like, oh, I can relate to this. I can feel like I'm actually there. I want to walk up and pick up this food or whatever. And that was kind of a revelation also, because it's the psychological element that you could play with as well as not just the visual element. So shoot everything and shoot often, because you have no idea what's going to look good and what's not going to look good, and you'll be surprised.
So, letting go and, letting the reality be reality, with that being said, you guys have brought up a few times, it's not about you, it's about, what's around you. Am I right? And, how do you kind of, how do you kind of let go of that control to a little bit of an extent without letting go of too much control, as we know as directors and filmmakers?
It's difficult. Well, number one, it's not about you. So you have to run. You hit record and you run off, or you use the live view, you run off, and all that. And you just have to remember that. Again, it's going to go back to the conversation that you just have to let reality happen. Number one, and then two, the depth of you have to be aware of what you're shooting. And there was so many times where we found ourselves about 3 or 4 days in where you'd stand up and you'd look and you'd just start turning around and look like this to see if it's going to be something interesting. And there would be certain areas where it's not that dark. And we were in a situation where there was a bunch of dancers and it was a public situation. And if we were going to use this commercially, if you all know, you have to use release forms for that sort of thing. And we're like, okay, about 4 or 5 rows in, we can kind of see. Past that, we don't really have to worry too much because it's dark back there. But the depth on this camera surprised the heck out of us, and we ended up having to run around collecting 70 to 100 release forms or something like after we realized how good it was. And because you're in real situations, if it's not like if it's not like a scripted set situation or something, there's going to be those elements of surprise where people that you don't expect that are going to be in the shot are going to run up and take a picture of it, or they see something, they see the camera, they see something on stage or what they're watching. And so all of a sudden there's this whole other person that you have to get a release form to, and someone else follows that person. But basically it's you have to be aware of every single element of the thing and everything that's around you, and know that if you deal in live situations, to try to get there early, put a crowd release form if you guys know what that is, or try to have a line producer or producer pick up those release forms for you. But it's that's...
I was just going to say that I think it also has a lot to do with taking traditional filmmaking techniques and turning them on their head or adapting to them. I saw Spherica has a booth here, and they're using sort of a remote-controlled skateboard with kind of a monopod in the middle and stabilized footage so you can actually move the camera in a way that's not going to make you motion sick, or putting it on a drone and having it stabilized, or on a cable cam system. Finding ways to tell your story that take advantage of the immersive capabilities of VR are really important, but ultimately it's the story that's the most compelling thing. If you look at a story that is so interesting and the characters are so interesting, it doesn't really matter what you shoot on. You look at films that are shot on phones that make it into Sundance and get distribution and get out there. If what you're producing is interesting, you'll find an audience for it. And I think that that's just as true in 360, and finding ways to get creative with how you use this format. And maybe it's that you're not always going to need to see 360 degrees. If you've got crew, if you've got lights, if you've got equipment, or you're going to need to plan ahead of time and think about how to paint them out so that you get the image and the story that you really want to tell. And that's going to continue to develop, and a lot of you in this room, I think, are going to either tell those stories or help develop the technology that makes it that much easier for filmmakers to tell the stories without having to worry as much about the technical aspect. As a filmmaker, I like to nerd out about that, but when I'm on set, I want to focus on getting the best performances I can. And I don't want to think about whether or not the aperture is right in the middle of an interview or in the middle of a scene. I want to just know that that stuff is going to work. So that's going to continue to evolve over the next several years, and I think that's what's really exciting about this.
So I know you guys learned quite a bit with filming with this camera. And one of those things is Wasim and even Andy and I know Sky, you guys all mentioned the same thing, as that there actually is a front to the camera, you know. And I see you laughed a little bit there about that. Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, the front of the camera, you know, and you know, actually even this scene right here that you guys have in Tahiti?
Yeah, we actually discovered this the hard way. As you can see, on the far right-hand side is our couple. They were our primary points of interest, and that was our focal point. But when we reviewed the footage, we realized that our focal point was the television, which was off, and of course, that was not where we wanted to have everyone looking. And Wasim can talk a little bit more about this because he had to deal with all of this madness in post.
Yeah, this was my first. I've done a lot of post-production, a lot of hours behind editing bays. This was my first time working with 360 footage, and when we pulled it in and I saw all the things that were, I literally couldn't sleep for almost 2 days because I was freaking out that we went out there and we wasted all this time and there was nothing I could do to get the focal points where we want, because that's another thing you have to focus on creatively is when you're shooting this stuff, is that there is a front of the camera, and you want to keep people's focus in certain directions. And if a host or a narrator starts walking in one way, the next scene after that is something that you're going to want to start where that person's head is, where that narrator disappeared. So you want to follow that motion with them, and that after 24, 48 hours of trying to figure out what the heck to do, I got a great suggestion out of him, which was to double up the layers in post and be able to restitch it ourselves by moving the layers in Premiere or Final Cut or whatever post-production you use, or whatever editor you use. And then we discovered the metal plugins. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the metal plugins, but if you're not, get familiar with them quickly, and whatever they cost, just buy them, because they'll save your life in so many situations. And that saved many, many hours of rendering things after we had to add double layers of huge data files and move things over and all that stuff. But the metal plugins, there's one in Premiere that just came out last month. I think the Premiere Skybox Studio or Skybox VR Studio. And you could just drop the plugin on there and just literally just drag the plane of view to where you want that focus to be. And that's super, super important. If you work in post with this stuff and you're not familiar with them, get the metal plugins, because I wasn't, and they were a godsend.
And I think that something else, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this if you've shot VR and worked with it, is that when you see an image like this and it's flattened out, you can see the entire frame. Whereas you're looking at something that's more spherical, you're going to be limited to what you're seeing in your field of view. And I know that Adobe just announced that they're going to add some VR tools and the ability to look at something in a more spherical viewpoint, which I think is going to be a huge benefit. I imagine that at some point in the very near future, and I'm sure people much smarter than I are working on how to do this, you'll be able to wear, let's say, a Gear VR and actually have maybe your controls overlaid and see it exactly as you would in the headset. I know I had a lot of trial and error playing with something, framing it, exporting it, and then looking at it through the Gear VR and realizing that what I really wanted to do was X, Y, or Z. So those things I think are going to become much more streamlined and a lot easier as the process evolves and as more people use it and start to be able to articulate what it is we want as filmmakers and how then to achieve it. So I think that's going to be a good thing.
But also, like, speaking of, I think it's still good practice to try to make a marker and use those same two lenses if you're using a stereoscopic camera, or depending on what camera you're using, but use the same configuration on that particular camera to face forward to the focus of the scene that you want if you have that scripted out, because, or if you have an idea of your head or an outline or a storyboard. Because then you bring in the sound aspect back into it, and if the sound is happening over here, and depending on what kind of, like, all that we were using on this shoot, because we were using a pre-production model of the Beyond, so some of the mics weren't activated yet, so we were using a Zoom recorder, if you guys are familiar with a Zoom digital recorder. And when you have it, and we're using the XY mics, it was a Zoom H5, so you could switch out the different kind of mic heads that you want in there. We were using an XY with a dead cat on it, or the wind buffer on it, and it actually plays to an advantage in the sense that when people are walking around, like, you hear it walking around on that thing, and so when you have the headset or when you have your earphones on and you're playing it back in the headset and someone is walking to the right, you'll hear that in that mic and you'll follow it, which is an advantage versus 2D filmmaking. But if you're using the same two lenses and you have the mic configured in the same direction, then you'll have the proper sound for that sort of thing. But if you don't, then you have to work with other post-processing tools in order to work the the sound to go 360 as well. I think with the production version, it's different now. But.
Right, and again, the product that they were using is a pre-production model. There, like anything else, there are some differences and changes that may be in the final production version. So you guys, the experience you had with it though is, in terms of 360, it's very similar to, a lot of 360 cameras out there, which is pretty great. In terms of, best practices for you guys, one of the things that I've learned the hard way, and I know some of us have learned the hard way, is to make sure you're cleaning every lens after every shot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a fingerprint on one of your lenses can ruin your stitch. And there are 17 lenses, so you have to be really cognizant. And before you hit record, just make sure that you're checking all the lenses and make sure that they look clean and crisp. Of course, we were in Tahiti, which has this really high humidity, really high heat, so that presented more challenges for us. We needed to make sure, probably a little bit more often than the average person, that our lenses were clean.
And the point to slate everything, I think, is a good one, both visually and sound-wise. If maybe you've encountered this in VR or you've encountered this previously, where sometimes the camera and the sound will drift out of sync over the course of a take. And I experienced that. We were filming a band, and thankfully I was able to sync it up by finding the drummer's, his countdown at the beginning and at the end, and I think I had to speed up the visual to 101.38%. Totally imperceptible to the end user, but it was able to keep everything in sync, and if I didn't have that, I probably would have been able to sync it at some point, but it's that much harder when you're doing it in VR if you don't have a really strong visual cue. So visually, sound-wise, sync or slate at the beginning and the end.
And another thing with the sound also is when you're shooting VR, you have to, it's another thing we had to remind ourselves and I had to remember was that you can see everything around you. So when I was also in post and there was a scene where we were on one of the beaches or we were on one of the boats and there was a motorboat that came behind us during one of the takes and that sound sounded better than the take that I had with the actual shot itself because there was less wind noise, and so I wanted to overlay that one and use that sound instead. But then all of a sudden, when you play it back, you're like, oh, wait a minute, there's the sound of a motorboat, but people can actually turn all the way around and see that there's no motorboat there. So that was another lesson that I learned in post, but to make sure that you're capturing the sound and using the sound with each take, which also helps with the slating at the beginning and the end of each one of those shots, because it's not as easy unless you have like a great Foley room to recreate that sound, to use just different sound from different takes, which I would traditionally use in a regular video or in a regular film or something, but I learned that you couldn't do that with this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and keep it short and sweet. Once you've had a chance to explore the space, once your user has done a complete 360, looked down, looked up, if there's no activity, if there's no action, it's boring. So you really have to think about keeping it succinct.
The converse of that is that sometimes it can be too short and not sweet enough, which is when you're looking at a flat image of your spread out 360, you're seeing everything. You're not experiencing it the same way that your audience is, where they're going to have to take it all in. So there were several times where I would have a shot up there for 8 or 10 seconds, which, as I'm sure you know, sometimes feels long in a traditional storytelling environment. But I felt that it wasn't long enough. If I had enough visual information to keep the shot interesting, looking at it in 360, there were times I wanted that shot up a little bit longer. So it's going to be a bit of trial and error, obviously looking at it through your HMD to find out if that shot is up there for the optimal amount of time. And as with anything, get some outside perspective. I think that's really important.
That's actually a really great point, because if you're used to watching regular video and editing or working with regular, the regular frame, it's once the narrator or the scene or the actor or whatever it is done saying what they're saying, and that scene is over, you think that scene is over, you just cut to the next one because all you're looking at is that plane. But the first couple of edits that I did of the video that we'll give you a link where you can, at the end of this, where you can watch those videos, but the first couple of edits, like I kind of did use the same method because that's what I'm used to over a decade. And then when I played it back, I'm like, wait a minute, so I'm just watching what's happening, but it did not give me any time to explore the scene. So this is one of those situations where I almost had to double the size of those scenes in order to give enough time for after the narrator said what they're saying or after the actor says what they're saying, to give the person that's got the headset on the chance to actually explore the entire scene. And it seems way long in the timeline when you're editing it, but once you put it on, it's like, okay, I get it. Like they need that time in order to explore that scene. So let those kind of let them marinate.
I think the key here to balance it out is to really have a variety of people provide feedback for you in post. Because you have to think about your audience and you have to think about, how experienced are they? How intelligent are they? Are they going to know to look for these cues? And the broader your subject base, the better.
So, talking about, you talked a little bit about post-production, Wasim. I'm sure most of us in here that have shot with 360 video have had quite a bit of experience with post-production. Wasim, you had mentioned a little bit earlier about the Skybox Studio and Metal. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you feel about this piece of plugin, the software here?
Yeah, obviously I'm glowing about this software because it just changed, it solved so many issues. Again, if you don't have them, get them. And if you're working with this footage and you're going to be, just get them. They just released the Premiere. They have the After Effects one, is what they started with, the After Effects plugins, and they just released the Premiere plugins, I think, at the end of last month or something, just in time for me to start working with this footage. But get them, get that stuff. And the other thing also is, once I started importing all the footage into my system, into my machine, I realized that you're working with a lot of data coming out of these cameras, and it was very apparent to me very quick that I would have to do something in order to be able to work with this data in a regular timeline and not wait for everything to render every single time I did something. And if you're not familiar with offline, are you guys familiar with offline editing? Who is, who's not? No one? Okay. For those of you that aren't, and you're going to start working with this footage and you don't have a super crazy computer yet, go ahead and learn to offline edit. And basically what you're doing is you're creating lower res versions of the actual footage so that it'll play back and you could work with it in your timeline. And then once you're done and you have your picture locked, then you can reconnect those files to the original high resolution files, as long as you do not change the names, keep the names exactly the same, because that will create an absolute nightmare if you don't. But if you keep those names the same, then you could just link them at the end and then you're solid. And also...
And Adobe, I think, is actually going to make this a one-click thing in the next version, is what I was reading, that you can, on import, you can actually create proxies, low-res proxies, work with those, and then simply toggle back and forth between your low-res and your high-res. In my case, I just converted all the MP4s that came from the Stitcher into ProRes because it was just a more stable and robust format for me. And I had no problem working on it on my desktop Mac and on my laptop using an SSD. So I think it's just about finding your own workflow, developing your own workflow. There aren't a lot of tutorials out there the way that there are for so many things, so you can't just go to lynda.com or YouTube and find things. To that end, I think it's about finding and building a community in VR as well. I mean, the number of emails that Wasim and I exchanged about, I'm trying to do this, how about this, figuring things out and troubleshooting, that's kind of the name of the game right now. And it'll get easier, but until that happens, building on that with one another is going to be how we continue to evolve this and make sure that we're making really good content so that the audience for this grows and doesn't get bored by seeing something that's maybe subpar. I think we owe it to them to give our best and to create that, and by working together we can.
Yeah.
Go on ahead. No.
I was just going to say, and be patient with them also, because again, a lot of us or most of us are very familiar with the medium, and a lot of things will be boring to us really quick because we're familiar with it. But for most of the audience out there, like, we learned that you have to be patient with them and for them to get it. And the things that we found exciting 2, 3, 4 months ago, they still haven't even been introduced to yet. So they're super getting excited about it. And that kind of speaks up to, I think, one of the next talking points is, not everybody has access to these headsets or they have these headsets yet. So if you're working with this footage, it's really hard to get feedback. And that was a tough part also, was to get feedback from people, because usually if you're just shooting or editing a video, they'll be with you in the edit bay, or you could send them a link to a preview. But with this, you couldn't. Like, you had to find either someone that had a headset, or if you were home, or if you were around or something. But take a Gear VR or a headset with you everywhere and have your footage loaded on there everywhere, because it's really, really valuable to get that feedback from people that especially that haven't experienced it yet and that are absolutely going to in the next 6, 7, or 8 months.
I just want to say that I think, at the beginning of cinema, we had people like the Lumiere brothers who were really visionaries, and they did a film at the very early days of just a train coming into a station. And there was sort of an urban legend about people reacting to that film at the time. But what actually happened was, several years later, they refilmed the train coming into the station in 3D. And at that point, people who were in the audience freaked out because it was unlike anything they had seen before, this train coming towards them. And I think we're at that point now where people who have never experienced 360 before, 2D, 3D, whatever, are having these aha moments when they realize the potential of this. It's sort of the beginning. Abel Gance was a filmmaker who in 1927 did a film called Napoleon, and he was the first person to really take cameras outside of studio environments, to move the camera, to come up with creative ways to tell those stories. He shot in traditional 4x3, your more square format, but for the third act, he created a triptych. So he was shooting with 3 cameras and then projected with 3 projectors. And that, too, kind of immersed the audience in ways that hadn't come before. And the fact that we can now do that in every direction is something that is going to take some people that first experience to understand what it is, and then repeated experiences of better and better content to really, I think, join this evolution and see what's possible.
I think that all of us in this room have a responsibility in the VR space to be advocates for VR, and to Wasim's point, we should be carrying these headsets with us wherever we go so that we're talking about what we're doing, we're showing people real examples, because you can't understand it unless you actually put on those goggles, unless you actually get in there and you feel immersed. It's not easy to describe that experience. And anyone who puts on these headsets, they just have a phenomenal experience. Anyone from the ages of 8 to 80, we were finding had a great experience with it. We were actually showing some of the footage that we took on Private Island in Tahiti, and we were showing it at the resort. And this one person put on the goggles. It was an underwater scene, and she was trying to reach out to grab the fish. And she was so immersed in it that she completely forgot where she was. She slammed her hand down into her salad and was feeling around at her food. And I thought that was a great example of really being involved and what this technology can do.
This woman was somewhere in her 70s, and she was totally into it. Like, there's not one person that we showed it to that was not into it. And it's again, like, we're around it now. We're around it more and more and more. So it's hard to convey that excitement of the first time someone puts it on, but it's really that excitement when you realize that everybody is into it, that's going to push this thing forward. So, like, you have to remind yourself that you have to get these people just as excited as you are about it, because they're the ones that are going to consume everything that we put out there for them. And that's everybody. Like she was saying, from 80 to 8, like, everybody we showed it to, the resort, and it opens a lot of doors right now too. Don't forget that.
Just keep sharp objects away from people when they're using it. I could see a lot of problems with that. Also, were there no people under the age of 8 who liked this?
I don't know that we talked.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, it's hard to communicate.
I imagine they would think it's pretty cool.
One of the things that we've discussed, though, just as a group, outside of everything, was, being able to immerse people in those different types of settings is pretty amazing. But even from a post-production process, Andy, you did some really interesting things in post-production with opening up the scene really wide, immersing the viewer into black and white. I mean, it was amazing, to be able to see everything. I was there for it, but now it's all black and white, and it really, puts a different perspective on the story itself as well. So
again, it was one of those things where you think, oh, I've seen black and white films, I've seen black and white photos, but I wanted to try it and see how it would work, and I was surprised that it didn't feel gimmicky. It just felt like it was a different experience than I had seen with that same scene in color. So I experiment, try things. I tried so many things just in post. Many of them failed, but by actually trying those, I was able to go, okay, now I know what not to do next time. Or thinking if I had another day to shoot, what I would take from that experience and build upon that. Having those experiences and repeated experiences, I think, is what is going to make any of us who are passionate about this better filmmakers.
Great. So we're just about ready to wrap it up. I know you guys had a big thank you slide here for everyone that was able to help you out with the shoots and the tours and all the stuff. And I know you also have your website as well, right? TakeTheRideVR.com, correct?
Yeah, we'll be posting a lot of the stuff that we shot out there in Tahiti. We did about 4 or 5 different videos that I wish we were able to show you here today. I might have one on one phone in the back that if some of you want to stick around, I can show you. But we're going to be posting them on that website, taketherideVR.com, in the next week or two, and you'll be able to see that stuff there.
And again, keep an eye out on the Milk VR channel for our content and other Project Beyond content.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much. Appreciate you all joining us here. Thank you. We do have a little bit of time for a quick Q&A. Does anyone have any questions for any of the creatives up here? Yes, sir. Well, actually, do we have a microphone that we can run around, or no? Is this it?
Speak up. I think for me, as far as a wish list, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but the ability to actually edit while wearing an HMD so that I can actually see what I'm doing, and I'm sure that that's coming. So that's definitely a big one. I think tools maybe out in the field for pre-visualizing or seeing things, you know, as technology improves, stitching will improve. Those live stitching options are really great right now. So I think that there are going to be a lot of tools that, with more experience in the field, I have no doubt that we'll come up with long, long lists of things. But those, definitely the ability to actually edit and utilize the HMD at the same time is going to be a big one.
That's absolutely my biggest one too. Because it's tough to you put together an edit and then you have to output it, put it back in the headset, and check it out and all that stuff. And when you get into a creative flow, that kind of breaks the flow, which sucks when that happens, because then you have to bring yourself back into that zone, like get back into that groove again. So that's to me also, that's like the big wish list, is to I know it's asking a lot, like right away at the moment, but that's definitely something that would help that flow a lot, or like help you stay in that space.
Great. I know there's a gentleman up here at the front.
How's footage stored on the camera?
I'm sorry?
How's the footage stored onto the camera?
It's a memory card right now at the current point in time, memory cards. Again, these are pre-production models that we are using at this point in time, so the final product may differ at that point. So, further questions? Yep, we've got the microphone getting passed around. There we go.
I haven't been lucky enough to try anything. I mean, I'm familiar with all the post stuff you talked about, but I haven't done it. And I'm waiting for my Gear headset to show up at the end of time, because I'm one of the millions of people who got the S7 so they could get their headset. Anyway, in the field shooting, quick snapshot of your post workflow to actually get it onto your Gear, onto your phone. Are you connecting your phone to your laptop or what? Like
Yeah,
you
directly
output-
to the laptop. You could side load the videos that you make into a special folder. Like you create a folder in your root on the Android, on the Samsung phone, and then you could just access that directly through the Gear VR. Once you put it on, you could access your side loaded content through the Milk VR channel.
There's a few different apps out there that you can actually view your own content on. So Milk VR is obviously one of the ones that we recommend the most. You can create if you'll see a Milk VR folder on there, you could add your video into the Milk VR folder. One
thing also with that is the extensions at the end of the files. Depending on what kind of file you're outputting, it has to be TB for top bottom or 3DV for top. Like you have to pay. There's different extensions depending on what kind of camera you're working with, what kind of footage you're working with, in order for it to play back properly. So there's a bunch of Reddit threads and different ways that you can find that stuff.
So as much as we'd love to keep taking questions here, we are actually out of time for Q&A at this point in time, but I think we'll take a minute or two to go over to the back. Is that okay, guys? Great. And if you have any further questions outside of the room, you're more than welcome to ask the creatives. Thank you very much for joining us again, and thank you guys for joining us.